All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we check out things that you might not be aware of because they have been suppressed. The powers that be don't want you to know some of the material that we're going to be discussing, and that's because it is impactful and it can really help you out with your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. And this is another in our series of Bible decodes, number 427. And we've mostly been focusing on the Roman origins hypothesis, which I would say is way beyond a hypothesis. But it is that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament. The Caesars of the Flavian dynasty from 69 to 96 AD. They wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. They backdated the story by 40 plus years and set the life of Jesus in the starting his ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius. So the late 20s, early 30s AD. But the real writing was done much later, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s AD, um, and even later. It was a generational thing. This is a psychological operation that lasted for a very long time. It may arguably still be going on, because nobody has found out about it, in spite of the fact that the Romans left a number of clues behind, which we should have grasped onto by now. Um, but so, um, the Jews had been a big headache for the Romans for over a century by this time, and you know, revolts, uprisings, terrorist attacks, insurrections, and finally a war, flat out, between the Romans and the Jews that lasted for 7 years. And it required um, the Romans to send in the Roman legions under General Vespasian, and then eventually under Vespasian's son Titus. And both Vespasian and Titus were actually wounded in the war. And when Vespasian became emperor, um, they mobilized and decided to put in this psychological operation in order to mellow out the Jews or to tame them, to domesticate them, to get them to get with the program. Because the Romans had a huge empire. They had a number of dozens of other nations and tribes under their umbrella. But the Jews were the most difficult to govern. And the Jews saw themselves as this chosen people, as a separatist group. They had all of these different rituals and beliefs, strictures, circumcision, and Sabbath observance, and kosher food laws that made them, different. Um, and the Romans needed to kind of get them to more see themselves as Romans and not so much as Jews. And so they took advantage of um, the fact that the Jews had this prophecy in their Old Testament books, um, that there was going to be a Jewish Messiah who comes. But this Jewish Messiah was going to be a military commander who was going to help the Jews overthrow the Romans or whatever power, oppressing power there was. So instead, the Romans created a Jewish Messiah who was a prince of peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' heavy backpack and turning the other cheek to oppression, while at the same time um, being very critical of the Jews and their rituals, their traditions, and their uh, infrastructure, their way of life. And so he demanded that his disciples, his Jewish disciples, abandon their families in order to follow him. And he uh, cussed out the Jews who were selling small animals at the temple for the animal sacrifices. And he criticized the Pharisees for following the Jewish rituals. He made light of and ignored the uh, Sabbath observance and working on the Sabbath. And he um, overturned the tables of the Jewish money changers uh, at the outskirts of the temple. Uh, and so this is a Jewish Messiah who was very totally deferential to the Romans while being highly critical of the Jews. And then as we move along in the New Testament to the epistles of Paul, Paul is even more pro Roman and even more anti Jew than Jesus was. So go figure that. And then add in the fact that the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament are all written in Greek, which is a language that most Aramaic fishermen and publicans did not possess. Even if they did, uh, even if they did read and write, they didn't read and write in Greek most likely, and but the Romans did. And throw in the fact that the Romans had full control of censorship and publishing and distribution within the empire. And then um, that will be your circumstantial evidence for the Roman origin of the New Testament. But then add in the direct evidence which comes from Josephus, or at least a lot of it comes from Josephus, the Roman historian who was writing from Caesar's palace and was known as Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, even though he was of Jewish extraction and just adopted by the Flavians. He wrote a 7-volume work called War of the Jews about this history of the war. And in the pages of War of the Jews, many of the uh, many parallels and correspondences between the Gospels and Josephus come to light, um, leaving you with the conclusion that whoever wrote Josephus also wrote the New Testament, or at least the Gospels, in particular the book of Luke. Michael Menescotz, in his book Christianity's Origin, found over 250 parallels between the work of Josephus and just the book of Luke. That means that there were over 10 per chapter on average. That means that the book of Luke is utterly saturated with parallels. And many of them are thickly described, like parallels with several different motifs in common. Not only that, but Menescotz then graphed the parallels on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, and found that by making that graph, he had formed 5 near perfect letters in Latin, APTVS. Latin being the emerging language of the Roman Caesars, and uh, T and V, no doubt standing for Titus and Vespasian. AP maybe for Holy Ghost, Agia Pneuma, or possibly Arius Piso, one of the very powerful Roman aristocrats that was kind of the shadow emperor for the Flavians. And basically, the Romans literally signed their names to the New Testament. Another relevant work there is Joseph Atwill's work, Caesar's Messiah, and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, who documents how the military campaign of General Titus in Judea is the model for the ministry of Jesus. If you compare the two, every place that Titus goes in his military campaign, as documented by Josephus, every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes in the same order. And at each location, they undergo parallel events that are spaced out by exactly 40 years, sometimes to the hour. And we're talking about 40 or more separate events, way beyond the realm of coincidence. And that's just the drop in the bucket. There are, you know, hundreds of other parallels, if not thousands of other parallels that you would have to get into by, getting yourself a copy of Josephus and going through it with your Gospels in hand, and the rest of your New Testament in hand as well. This is something I'm not expecting you to believe me, but I'm hoping that what I say will get you to get yourself a copy for yourself. And so you can confirm this. This is not, you know, um, something that doesn't require your participation. Now, today we're looking at, continue to look at this book from Kersey Graves that is called 16 Crucified Saviors. And this book looks at the sources that the Romans used to put together the Gospels. Now, this author, writing way back in 1876, is unaware of the Roman origins of the New Testament, but he is aware that whoever wrote the New Testament borrowed liberally from much older traditions, and that the entire story of Jesus is a borrowing, plagiarism from much older sources, ancient Indian mythology and religion in particular, and also ancient Roman and Jewish, Roman and Greek Stoicism, philosophy of Stoicism, also a lot of Egyptian sources, pagan mystery schools, including astrology and numerology and shamanism. Um, there's some ancient Chinese, Confucianism, Taoism, ancient Persian sources from Zoroastrianism and Mithraism, and quite a few other sources as well. So Graves looks at all of these, what he calls 16 crucified saviors before Christianity. So if you are Christian and you think that your story is original and that it is unique, you are lying to yourself, because you are unaware of these older stories that have a lot of the same themes, the same specifics, and the same motifs. Now, we're about to start chapter 36 of this book, which is called Philosophical Absurdities of the Doctrine of the Divine Incarnation. There is a philosophical principle underlying the doctrine of divine incarnation, whose logical deductions completely overthrow the claim of Jesus of Nazareth to the Godhead, and which we regard as settling the question as conclusively as any demonstrated problem in mathematics. This argument is predicated upon the philosophical axiom that two infinite beings, or any description or conception, cannot exist, either in whole or in part at the same time, and per consequence, it is impossible that the Father and Son should both be God in a divine sense, either conjointly or separately. The word infinite comprehends all, and all, it covers the whole ground. It fills the immensity of the universe and fills it to repletion so that there is no room left for any other being to exist. And whoever and whatever does exist must constitute a part of this infinite whole. Now, the Christian world concedes that the Father is God, always and truly, perfect, complete, and absolute, that there is nothing wanting in him to constitute him God in the most comprehensive and absolute sense of the term, that he is all we can conceive of as constituting God, the one only true God, as in John 17:8, and was such from all eternity, before Jesus Christ was born into the world. And Paul puts the keystone into the arch by proclaiming, to us there is but one God, the Father, which he says in 1 Corinthians 8:6. Hence, we have here a logical proposition as impregnable as the rocks of Gibraltar, that the Father alone is or can be God, which effectually shuts out every other and all other beings in the universe from any participation in the Godhead with the Father. And thus, this parity of reasoning demonstrates that the very moment you attempt to make Christ God, or any part of the Godhead, you attempt a philosophical impossibility. You cannot introduce another being as God in the infinite sense until the first named infinite God is dethroned and put out of existence. And this, of course, is a self-evident impossibility. If it were not such, then we should have two gods, both absolute and infinite. On the other hand, if that other being, who with the Christians is Jesus Christ, with the Hindu Krishna, with the Buddhists Sakya, etc., is introduced as only part of the infinite and perfect God, then it is evident to every mind with the least philosophical perception that some change or alteration must take place in the latter before such a union can be effected. But such a change or any alteration in a perfect infinite being would at once reduce him to a changeable and finite being, and thus he would cease to be God. For it is a clear philosophical and mathematical axiom that a perfect and infinite being cannot become more than infinite. And if he could and should become less than infinite, he would at once become finite, and thus lose all the attributes of the Godhead. To say or assume, then, that Christ was God in the absolute or divine sense, and the Father also God absolute, and yet that there is but one God, or that the two could in any manner be united so as to constitute but one God, is not only a glaring solecism, but a positive contradiction in terms, and an utter violation of the first axiomatic principles of philosophy and mathematics. It also asserts the illogical hypothesis that a part can be equal to the whole, It first assumes the Father to be absolutely God, then assumes the Son also to be absolutely God, and finally assumes each to be only a part and has to unite them to make a whole and complete God, and thereby culminates the theological farce. Such is Christian ratiocination. Again, it is conceded by Christians that the Father is an omnipresent being, and we have shown that it is a mathematical impossibility for two omnipresent beings or two beings possessing any infinite attributes to exist at one and the same time. Hence, the clear logical deduction that the Son could not be omnipresent and per sequence not God. Again, we have another philosophical maxim or axiom familiar to every schoolboy that no two substances or beings can occupy the same place at the same time. The first must be removed before the second can, by any possibility, be introduced, in order thus to make room for the latter. But as omnipresent means existing everywhere, there can be no place to remove an omnipresent being to, or rather, there can be no place or space he can be withdrawn from in order to make room for another being, without his ceasing to be omnipresent himself and thereby ceasing to be God. It is thus shown to be a demonstrable truth that the omnipresence of the Father does and must exclude that of the Son, and thus exclude the possibility of his apotheosis, or incarnated deityship. In other words, it is established as a scientific principle upon a philosophical and mathematical basis that Jesus Christ was not and could not be the great I am, the only true God. We will notice one other philosophical absurdity involved in the doctrine of the divine incarnation, one other solecism comprehended in the childish notion which invests the infinite God with finite attributes, is a well established and well understood axiom in philosophy that the less cannot be made to contain the greater. A pint bottle cannot be made to contain a quart of wine. For the same reason, a finite body cannot contain an infinite spirit. Hence, philosophy presses the conclusion that the man Christ Jesus could not have comprehended in himself the Godhead bodily, inasmuch as it would have required the infinite God to be incorporated in a finite human body. We are therefore compelled to reject the doctrine of the incarnate divinity, the belief in the deityship of Jesus Christ, because it involves a direct tilt against some of the plainest principles of science and challenges, virtually overthrows, some of the fundamental laws of both natural and moral philosophy. No philosopher, therefore, does or can believe in the absolute divinity of Jesus Christ. Okay, that is the end of chapter 36, which, you know, is, I think, splitting hairs, but, I understand where he's coming from. Chapter 37 is called Physiological Absurdities of the Doctrine of the Divine Incarnation. Now, we're going to get into this tomorrow, but just to remind you that Graves is writing in 1876. This is kind of the height of the positivist, scientific um, materialism, that. So, when I talk about the five Western religions, talk about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Satanism, and Scientism, or otherwise known as atheism, or otherwise known as communism. And these five religions, I think, all need to be put to bed. But, scientism is a religion. And I believe that Mr. Graves here is somewhat infected with the scientism religion, as quite a few other scientific people were at this time. Um, this was just after Darwin came out, and you know, um, people had just a very, very strong belief in science. And that is just as pernicious, if not more pernicious. Like I've said, Christianity is my favorite of these five Western religions. Um, you know, um, Scientism is more pernicious, than Christianity. But so that is kind of uh, this next chapter that we get into here. He's probably going to be tripping over himself because of his scientism. But anyway, we'll find that out tomorrow when we return. Today, thanks for tuning in. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and contribute. And we'll see you next time for another episode of the Bible Decode series. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.